Good day. Today's lecture will focus once again on the topic of intelligence. And more pointedly, we're going to spend some time speaking about the United Nations and the permanent members that make up the Security Council. We get ready to share the presentation with you, and we will get ready to open up the discussion on this topic. So once again, my name is John Weaver, and I have a doctorate in public administration. And a little bit about me: I'm an associate professor of intelligence analysis at York College at Pennsylvania here in the United States. And I'm also the president of Global Reconnaissance Solutions. And this week's talk is going to focus on a book that I recently published titled The United Nations Security Council Permanent Member Perspectives. And what we're going to look at is the implications for U.S. and global intelligence professionals. And this here is a copy of the book cover. The book came out in late 2019. The publisher is Peter Lang. And for those that are interested in acquiring a copy, you can order it on Amazon, or you can go to Peter Lang's website directly. Or if you're not interested in buying a copy of the book, you can also request it through your local library. And I'll preface this by saying that as I talk about the issues related to the United Nations Security Council permanent member perspectives, that there's a lot more detail in the book. I'm just giving you a cursory overview of what I was able to achieve by conducting qualitative research and some of the highlights of the findings as a result of doing a deeper dive into this research. So let's go ahead and begin. The topics that we're going to discuss are listed above. We're going to focus initially on the research questions, methodologies, and limitations. Then we're going to segue into the United Nations. I'll provide you with a contextual overview of the organization. Then we'll dive down specifically into the United States, looking at an overview of priorities. This is stemming from some documents that came out of the current administration's their priorities back in late 2017 and early 2018. And I actually had a journal article that came out a couple of years ago where I dissected these on behalf of the United States. And then we're going to briefly touch on China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom, the 4 other members other than the US that are permanent members of the Security Council. And then I'm really going to spend more time conducting the analysis and findings, diving deeper into the research questions, and then answering those. And of course, I'll summarize this with a conclusion. So let's go ahead and begin. I focused on 3 research questions. Basically, the question 1 deals with how, 2, why, and the third looks at the implications for the United States. And more pointedly, we're looking at the implications for those that either are academics studying the field of intelligence, or those that are intelligence professionals, most notably those that work in the US, as well as allied nations to the United States. The research methodology. I employed a qualitative research methodology. I focused solely on secondary data, and I used 2 models, and I'll go over the models in just a second, but the first is YIRTM Intelligence Red Team Model Modified, and the second is the Federal Secondary Data Case Study Triangulation Model. In the book, I conducted a meta-analysis, and I actually provided the words that I used for the meta-analysis to assist me in acquiring the sources that I used through the second model there. And the limitations, I'll basically preface this by saying that the time period I looked at was over the last 5 years. No primary data were used, like questionnaires, interviews, and surveys, and I only focused on open source data. Obviously, there's classified information that the intelligence community has that they can use to complement the study, the results of this study. So the first model, again, is the YIRTM Intelligence Red Team Model Modified. This looks at a strategic direction of a nation, and it looks at the 4 instruments of national power: diplomacy, information, military, and economic means. And what is the shaped outcome that the nation employing these, in this case, or the case of the study, we're going to look at China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom, to either maintain the status quo or enhance their position in future years. And the second model was the Federal Secondary Data Case Study Triangulation Model. It focuses on 3 primary components: plans and systems, to the bottom left, documents, legislation, and policy, and then press releases, testimony, interviews, and biographies to kind of give you more of an oral flavor. All of this looks to provide assessments, looking at scholarly and government reports, as well as key public leaders and what they have to say, all to triangulate in on the results to figure out what is going on with those 4 other permanent members of the Security Council. So some context, the United Nations. It was founded in 1945. It was kind of like the 2.0 as a result of the failure of the League of Nations coming out of, preventing World War I, or actually World War II from occurring. And then we look at the organs. So the General Assembly, most folks are familiar with the General Assembly. That deals with all nations that are consignatories to the United Nations. Most world leaders will address the United Nations General Assembly, at least once a year at their annual conference. But we're going to focus really on the second one, which is the Security Council. The Security Council consists of 15 members, only 5 of which are permanent. The other 10 rotate out every year over a 3-year period. And then there's other components, but we're not going to focus on these at this time. The United States, an overview, provides some information on this. If you look at President Trump's national security strategy, as well as key plans coming out from the Department of Defense and State, Homeland is at the center. We're looking at such things as energy, the finance and banking sector, safety and health, communications and transportation, all of which can contribute to a strong nation, a strong United States continuing to go forward into the future. With a focus on prosperity. Of course, in order to remain an economic powerhouse, we need to be a prosperous nation. Peace through strength abroad. The U.S. has many forward operating bases throughout the world, a forward posture with a military presence. Advancing American influence, as well as looking at soft versus hard power. So soft looks at more diplomatic initiatives, trade agreements and stuff of that nature, versus hard power, which is using the military instrument of power to coerce or influence other nations to come around to our way of thinking. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of the nations, but as you can see in the bottom part of the presentation here, I do look at diplomacy, information, military, and economic means for each country. Why is China important? 1, it is the 2nd largest economy in the world, and 2, in terms of population, it is the largest. And there are economists that predict that in the next several years, going out a decade plus, that China could surpass the United States as being the strongest and biggest economy in the world. Next is France. France ranks 21st overall in terms of population and ranks 6th in the world in terms of GDP. And once again, you'll see on this slide, I've broken it down with the key findings for diplomatic, information, military, and economic needs. Okay, continuing on, we can now spend a little time on Russia. Russia is an antagonist that has presented us with a lot of unique challenges in recent years. They rank in the top 10 in terms of population, and 12th in regards to other nations in terms of its gross domestic product. So a formidable actor, and one that has actually exerted great military influence throughout the world recently. Most notably, we've seen their forays into the Middle East in propping up Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, and then also lending support to Iran, and then on the European continent in its actions to annex Crimea a few years ago, as well as its efforts to influence activities in Ukraine. So again, you break down diplomatic, information, military, and economic applications that Russia is exerting in order to create influence favorable to its standing in the world. Finally, we've got the United Kingdom. This ranks number 22 in the world in terms of population, and the GDP puts it in the top 5 in the world. And then if you look at diplomatic, information, military, and economic means, these are some of its considerations, the most important of which is, if you look at that last piece under the economic component in looking at Brexit as it looks to extricate itself from the European Union. It's got to do this right so as to not adversely affect its economic standing in the world. And we'll get into some specifics in just a minute. So now let's go ahead and answer the research question. So when we look to, how are permanent members of the Security Council doing things to shape an outcome that is favorable to them? Well, diplomatically, the nations will pursue measures to help increase their prominence in the world. Information is the key to help garnering that support, and Russia will most likely use its influences and adeptness in social media to help shift elections where possible, to lend support to politicians who have leanings towards it. And Russia and China will most likely make use of cyber as a way to continue to steal secrets, proprietary information, and military blueprints. All countries are moving in the direction that will tighten what we call C&D, or computer network defenses, in an effort to mitigate the effects of other countries into future election cycle meddling. And militarily, Russia and China will most likely increase expenditures relative to their gross domestic product. And conversely, France and the United Kingdom will either maintain or only make modest increases due to the economic hardships that they experienced in a recent European recession. One thing is certain, though, that all nations are against the Islamic State, more specifically and more broadly, terrorism in general. Here, all 5 nations are in concurrence that terrorism is bad and see nothing favorable coming out by the proliferation of terror groups. China will most likely try to fill the vacuum left by the US, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Russia can use weapons sales as a way to provide it with hard currency and can leverage petroleum shipments, provided that the cost of oil goes up again, as it sells it to many Eastern European and other countries to hedge against NATO influence in the region. Economically, Europe will have to prepare for the UK's departure from the European Union so as to not adversely move the continent back into recession, and this most aptly affects the United Kingdom as well as France. When turning back to China, intelligence analysts should look at indicators of trading alliances, economic growth, and leadership that China hopes to rise to fill such things as the TPP vacuum from the US pulling out. And Russia is a unique challenge to those that work in the intelligence community, and its economic viability will be interlinked broadly on the global commodities market. Now let's turn to question 2, why? So when we look at why, the permanent members of the UNSC at times will see utility in sharing information with one or more members for the advancement of their own security interests. Diplomatic efforts can help maintain alliances, and all countries would like to either maintain or rise in prominence and will attempt to use their diplomatic efforts broadly to do so. The permanent members will use information to help shape public perceptions, to help promote their image, and likewise, they will invest in the protection against propaganda and other influences exerted by other nation states and non-state actors. Investment will continue in their militaries, with the likely increase in those of China and Russia, and the maintenance of capabilities in France and the United Kingdom. Economically, China will use its position as the second largest economy to grow and fill the vacuums left by the US, retracting its economic influence abroad. And Russia would like to continue to grow its economy in order to export petroleum sales, metals, weapons, etc., provided that it sees easing in sanctions levied against it. And France would like to fill the leadership vacuum on the mainland continent of Europe as the UK looks to extricate itself from the European Union. Question 3. Information as an instrument of national power has implications among the 4 other permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. Most notably, China and Russia will likely remain major users of cyber as a way to weaken the United States, and by extension its 2 allies, France and the United Kingdom. And this has been underscored by a recent economic report showing an increase over the years of state-on-state cyber attacks. Cyber continues to be a major vulnerability in our country, the United States, and accordingly, the U.S. must invest in greater cybersecurity to have a more effective, robust, what we call TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures, to mitigate exposure from the vulnerabilities. And France and the UK should too as well as other developed nations allied to the United States. Moreover, what is necessary is the implementation of improved TTPs to detect, respond, and to mitigate from cyber threats. The intelligence community, the IC, both military and civilian components, and others that are enduring long-term allies, must come to terms with the new reality and can use the YIRTM-M, the first model that I covered, and the approach to DIME, the diplomacy, information, military, and economic components, to gain granularity regarding the situation as they look at potential impacts of their decisions or relationships among the countries with whom they interact. Continuing on, this is a figure from the book, and the darker the color, the more that the nation is leaning on those specific instruments from the York Intelligence Red Team model modified to exert influence on the world stage. Conversely, when looking at the secondary data sources that I used, again, the darker colors represent those that are more in use by the various nation states, the 4 other permanent members of the UN Security Council, okay? So once again, this is kind of an overview of a recent publication of mine on the United Nations, specifically looking at the permanent members of the Security Council and what the implications are for the United States going forward. My contact information, if you want to reach me, I'm at jweaver10@ycp.edu. That's my email. Then if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, my handle is simply John Michael Weaver, all one word. And my website is globalreconnaissance.com. Thank you for joining me for today's lecture. I wish you all the best, and I look forward to seeing you back here.